Sunday, April 14th, 1912. As Titanic's third full day on the North Atlantic began, the mighty liner lived, teemed with life and activity. To many who were aboard, many of that day's activities would be etched vividly in their minds, a day filled with so many happy memories. The details of what happened that day would echo clearly in their minds even decades later. Little did anyone aboard know, but Titanic had entered the last full day of her maiden voyage, and the sense of routine and normalcy would change abruptly shortly before midnight that night. Titanic steamed through scattered rain showers during the early morning hours of Sunday, April 14, 1912, but the day dawned bright and sunny. Strong northwest winds of about 20 knots caused the scheduled lifeboat drill to be canceled, but happily the weather was pleasant rather than stormy. First-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie, a historian and author, was a seasoned traveler. On this voyage, however, he had foregone his tradition of physical activity and exercise during a sea crossing. By Sunday morning, however, enough was enough, and he decided it was high time to pick his routine back up and maintain it for every succeeding day of the crossing. He wrote, "I was up early before breakfast and met the professional racket player in a half hour's warming up, preparatory for a swim in the 6-foot deep tank of salt water, heated to a refreshing temperature. In no swimming bath had I ever enjoyed such pleasure before." Gracie then made his appointments for another round of squash, a workout in the gymnasium, all followed by a refreshing swim on Monday morning. Gracie's recollections have taken on a special importance in the last few years in helping to debunk the myth that Titanic was a sort of seagoing, towering inferno by Sunday, April 14th, with a spreading coal bunker fire threatening to engulf the ship. Why? The actual documented location of the coal bunker fire was just below the swimming bath that Gracie swam in. Recall that Gracie said that it was heated to a refreshing temperature, not a scalding one. In all truth, the coal bunker fire had been extinguished the previous day, and stokers had entered the bunker and rubbed oil over the scorched area of the bulkhead within where the paint had been cooked off. Happily, the now extinguished coal bunker fire was no longer a concern to anyone on board. At 9:12 a.m., a wireless message from the Cunard liner Caronia came in. It was addressed to Captain Smith by title and included the proper prefix MSG for a master service message containing important navigational information. It read, "MSG, Captain Titanic. Westbound steamers report bergs, growlers, and field ice in 42 degrees north, from 49 to 51 west, April 12th, compliments, Captain Barr." The message was delivered to Captain Smith, whose response was transmitted at 10:28 a.m. "Thanks for the message and information. Have had variable weather throughout, Smith." Very shortly after this message was sent, Captain Smith personally conducted the Sunday services in the first-class dining saloon. Interestingly, although the services were very well attended, to this date, Eleanor Casimir is the only passenger who seemed to directly mention the fact that the services were actually conducted by Captain Smith. Perhaps the fact that the captain presided over these services was so routine that no one else thought to record this detail. The service concluded with the hymn, "O God, Our Help in Ages Past," also known as the Prayer for Those at Sea or Eternal Father, Strong to Save. Gracie remembered that this particular hymn was a favorite of his friend and fellow passenger, James Clinch Smith. In second class, Assistant Purser Reginald Barker conducted the Sunday services. Second-class passenger Thomas Biles, a pastor from Leeds, England, conducted a Catholic Mass in the second-class lounge, and later on conducted services for third-class passengers. At 11:47 a.m., another wireless communication arrived, this one from the liner Noordam, relayed by Coronia. MSG, Captain SS Titanic. Congratulations on new command. Had moderate westerly winds, fair weather, no fog. Much ice in latitude 42 degrees 24 minutes north to 42 degrees 45 minutes, and longitude 49 degrees 50 minutes to 50 degrees 20 minutes. Compliments, Captain Krall. Captain Smith's reply was sent at 12:31 p.m. Captain Noordam, many thanks. Had moderate variable weather throughout. Compliments, Smith. At noon, the ship's position was calculated, and her daily run since the preceding noon was found to be 546 nautical miles, her average speed being 22.06 knots. Titanic's route from Daunt's Rock outside of Queenstown to the Ambrose Light outside New York waters was comprised of 2,891 nautical miles. Up to noon on Sunday, she had steamed 1,549 of those miles, with only 1,342 left to cover. Based on the amount of the overnight clock setback planned from April 14th to 15th, of 47 minutes, we also know what position they expected to reach by noon on Monday, and they were planning a run of about 546 nautical miles between noon Sunday and noon Monday. Throughout the day on Sunday, Titanic's clocks were running 2 hours and 2 minutes ahead of time in New York and 2 hours and 58 minutes behind time in London. Knowing the ship's noontime position, if Titanic had only maintained her speed from that noon forward, it was likely that, barring bad weather, fog, or something else that could slow her down, she would pass the entrance to New York Harbor at about 11 p.m. Tuesday night, tying up at White Star's Pier 59 on the lower west side of Manhattan at roughly 6:30 a.m. Wednesday morning. We know that as Titanic entered the Gulf Stream, preparations were underway to increase her speed through the water. This was in an attempt to help at the very least maintain her actual geographic speed despite the current's effects. Although the 5 auxiliary boilers in Boiler Room Number 1 were not lit at any point during the day, on Sunday morning, the last 3 primary boilers were lit. By Sunday evening, Titanic would be steaming under full pressure from all 24 of her primary boilers. There was even talk of a full-speed run for a few hours on Monday afternoon if the weather was good. Talk throughout the ship that afternoon and evening was that Titanic would indeed be arriving in New York on Tuesday evening rather than Wednesday morning. Over lunch that day in the second-class dining saloon, Assistant Purser Reginald Barker brought this up to his table companions, who included Lawrence Beasley. As they talked, the group noticed that Titanic had taken on a perceptible list to port. It was subtle, but it was definitely there. Barker ventured an educated guess that the coal supply had likely been used up faster from the starboard side than the port side, and considering the fact that the starboard bunker in Boiler Room Number 5 had been emptied in order to extinguish the coal fire, his guess was likely spot on. In any case, this very slight list to port of about 2 degrees did nothing to spoil the trip, and was more of a curiosity than anything else. The weather that Sunday afternoon was proving much cooler than previous days. Topping out at about 48 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 8.8 degrees Celsius, the temperatures quickly began to drop as the afternoon passed, and the high winds made the decks so breezy that most passengers chose to stay off the decks and find shelter inside. Because of this, the second-class library on C deck, Lawrence Beasley discovered, was very crowded. Even inside the ship, many passengers found that the heating system simply wasn't keeping up with the bitter cold. First-class passenger Philip Mock and his sister Emma Scabert remembered seeing people sitting around the public room wearing coats and furs, some of them complaining and wondering why the boat was not heated more comfortably. Margaret Brown remembered something similar. The general talk turned to the fact that Titanic must be approaching an area of ice. Titanic's officers were well aware that they were in the proximity of ice. At about 12:45 p.m., while Second Officer Lightoller was keeping watch so that First Officer Murdoch could eat lunch, Captain Smith came on the bridge. He held out the 9:12 a.m. ice warning from Caronia and showed it to his second officer so that he could read it. More ice warnings came in that afternoon. At 1:49 p.m., the German steamer America sent to the steamer Titanic, MSG, via Cape Race to the Hydrographic Office, Washington, D.C. America passed two large icebergs in 41 degrees 27 minutes north, 50 degrees 8 minutes west on the 14th April. Captain Nuth. 5 minutes later, at 1:54 p.m., the White Star liner Baltic sent another. MSG, Captain Smith, Titanic. Have had moderate variable winds and clear fine weather since leaving. Greek steamer Athenai reports passing icebergs and large quantities of field ice today in latitude 41.51 north, longitude 49.52 west. Last night, we spoke with German oil tank steamer Deutschland, Stettin to Philadelphia, not under control, short of coal, latitude 40.42 north, longitude 55.11 west. Wishes to be reported to New York and other steamers. Wish you and Titanic all success. Commander Ranson. Captain Smith later handed this message to Bruce Ismay as they crossed paths on deck. Ismay casually pocketed the message and then went down to lunch. Captain Smith formally sent his response at 2:57 p.m. Commander, Baltic. Thanks for your message and good wishes. Had fine weather since leaving. Smith. In spite of the frigid cold outside and the fact that Titanic was not very warm inside, many passengers continued to enjoy the spirit of camaraderie that had been noticed earlier in the voyage. Unfortunately, there was also an accident. Renee Harris, returning to her cabin from a private card game on B deck, slipped and fell on the grand staircase, suffering a compound fracture of the elbow and ending up in an embarrassing heap at the foot of the stairs. Dr. O'Loughlin attended, but the couple also asked a fellow passenger, Dr. Henry Froenthal, to consult. A number of passengers sent notes and well wishes to the Harris' cabin that afternoon, and Mrs. Futrell stayed with Renee a great deal from that point forward. Fourth Officer Boxall remembered working in the chart room later that afternoon, between 4 and 6 p.m., and seeing the Caronia ice message on the notice board over the table. He copied it down, put it on a chit, and took it to the captain's chart room, where he put it on the chart. At 5:50 p.m., Titanic made her scheduled course change known as turning the corner, where she settled on a new course that lined her up with the entrance to New York Harbor. Contrary to what has been said over the years, this course change was not delayed by a full hour in order to steam further south and avoid the ice. In fact, the wreck position and the known coordinates of the corner turn disprove that theory entirely. When she made this course change, Titanic was really within 3 miles or so of the actual position where the turn should have been made, a very small navigational difference. The sun set ahead of Titanic's bow at about 6:52 p.m. ship's time. A few minutes later, at 7 p.m., the air temperature was 43 degrees Fahrenheit, or just above 6 degrees Celsius. At the same time, the stiff breeze that had been blowing all day began to slacken and then stop entirely. In its place, a great stillness, an unusual calm on the often stormy North Atlantic set in. There was no wind, the sea was like a mill pond, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Dinner was served at around 7 p.m. Bruce Ismay had asked ship's surgeon, Dr. O'Loughlin, to join him in the first-class restaurant instead of dining alone. Captain Smith came upon Bruce Ismay in the first-class smoking room between 7:10 and 7:15 p.m., and he asked Ismay to have the ice warning from the Baltic back so that he could put it in the chart room for the other officers to see. Also at about 7 p.m., the last 3 primary boilers, which had been fired earlier in the day, were connected to the engines. That evening, passengers would notice the vibration of the ship's engines more than they ever had before, and they almost universally agreed that the ship's engine RPMs must have been increased. At 7:22 p.m. in the Marconi room, Harold Bride overheard a message from the Leyland liner Californian, a warning about ice in the area. Bride was so busy that he didn't stop to acknowledge the transmission just then, but when he overheard Californian's operator sending the same message again at 7:37 p.m., this time to the Antillean, Bride both acknowledged it and took it to the officer of the watch on the bridge, delivering it within about 2 minutes. The message read, MSG to Captain Antillean, 6:30 p.m. in apparent ship's time. Latitude 42 degrees 3 minutes north, longitude 49 degrees 9 minutes west. 3 large bergs 5 miles to the southward of us. Regards, Captain Lord. On Sunday evening, stewardess Mary Sloane encountered Thomas Andrews again. Whereas she had thought that he had been a little out of sorts earlier in the trip, on this night his spirits seemed to be much higher. She thought that he looked splendid. Indeed, dinner that night was going to be a genuine delight. Everything seemed to come together during the meal, whether it was in the first-class dining saloon or the a la carte restaurant. On this evening, the restaurant would be particularly popular. The Widener family hosted a dinner in Captain Smith's honor, and Mrs. Douglas, who also dined in the restaurant with her husband that night, remembered the trio of musicians was playing music in the corridor outside. Very likely, they were performing with the very same upright piano which had originally been found in Olympic's restaurant when she'd entered service in 1911, and which seems to have been transferred to Titanic to grace her restaurant reception room just outside the restaurant. Jacques and May Futrelle also dined in the restaurant. She recalled, "It was a brilliant crowd. Jewels flashed from the gowns of the women. And oh, the dear women, how fondly they wore their latest Parisian gowns. It was the first time that most of them had an opportunity to display their newly acquired finery. The soft, sweet odors of rare flowers pervaded the atmosphere. I remember at our table was a great bunch of American beauty roses. The orchestra played popular music. It was a buoyant, oh, such a jolly crowd. It was a rare gathering of beautiful women and splendid men. There was that atmosphere of fellowship and delightful sociability that make the Sabbath dinner on board ship a delightful occasion." At 8 p.m., 4th Officer Boxall came on watch and found 3rd Officer Pittman in the chart room working on the calculations from the stellar navigational observations they had made shortly earlier. Boxall picked up where Pittman left off. Meanwhile, standby Quartermaster Hitchens, who was just coming on duty, noticed that the thermometer on the bridge read a chilly 31.5 degrees Fahrenheit, or just below 0 degrees Celsius. As dinner began to wind down, the 5-man quintet began to perform their after-dinner concert at 8 p.m. in the first-class reception room. It would continue until 9:15. Passengers began to drift out of the saloon into the adjacent reception room to listen and have an after-dinner cup of coffee, and spend some time with their friends. The Countess of Rothes remembered that the last piece of music the band played that night was music from the Tales of Hoffmann by Jacques Offenbach. In second class at 8:30 p.m., passengers had arranged a hymn sing-song in the dining saloon, which was well attended. Shortly afterward, between 8:30 and 9 p.m., in the Marconi office, Titanic finally came within range of the Marconi station at Cape Race, Newfoundland. Jack Phillips began transmitting a backlog of messages waiting to be sent there. His assistant, Harold Bride, had agreed to come on duty at midnight, instead of 2 a.m. as he usually did, to help Phillips get caught up on his sleep. With the dinner held in his honor winding down, Captain Smith bid his table companions good evening and went to the bridge, where he arrived at about 8:55 p.m. He found 2nd Officer Lightoller standing a bitter cold, but very quiet watch. The two men talked for a little while. Smith remarked on the cold, and Lightoller agreed that it was cold. "There is not much wind," Smith noted. Lightoller added, "No, it is a flat calm as a matter of fact." Lightoller also said that it was a pity that the breeze hadn't kept up with them while they were going through the vicinity of the ice. If there had been any waves, they would have shown a dog's bone of foam as they broke along a berg's base, making an iceberg much more detectable in the dark. The two men agreed that with the weather being clear, they should still be able to see any icebergs at a good distance, but Captain Smith added that if it became in a slight degree hazy, then they would certainly have to slow down and proceed very carefully. At 9:25, he said to Lightoller, "If it becomes at all doubtful, let me know at once. I will be just inside." Then he left the bridge. However, Captain Smith did not retire for the night at that point, as is often claimed. Instead, Fourth Officer Boxall remembered seeing Captain Smith around the wheelhouse and chart room long after that point. Although there's no record of him venturing back out onto the open bridge, at least until after 10 p.m., when the change of the officer's watch would come, he certainly wasn't sleeping. In third class, things were quite cheery that evening, with a lot of music and dancing in the general room. Eugene Daly, who had played his Elan pipes as Titanic left Queenstown, moved around the room playing lively tunes on them again. A rat was seen scurrying across the room during the party, and some of the boys gave chase to it, while the girls squealed in excitement. At 9:52 p.m., a message from the ship Mesaba was received. It was addressed to Titanic by name and other ships. It said, "Ice report. In latitude 42 north to 41.25 north, longitude 49 west to longitude 50.30 west. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice. Weather good. Clear." Phillips acknowledged the message, but with Bride asleep and him being so busy, he did not take it to the bridge. Importantly, although this message concerned navigation, it was neither addressed to Captain Smith personally, nor was it preceded by the official MSG prefix that would have warranted its special care and delivery. At 10 p.m., First Officer Murdoch arrived on the bridge to relieve his old friend Second Officer Lightoller as officer of the watch. They chatted for a few minutes, passing along some items of interest such as the ship's course and speed, and giving Murdoch's eyes enough time to adjust to the darkness. Lightoller told Murdoch that they were approaching the field ice which had been reported to them throughout the day, and that he expected they would reach it at around 11 p.m. He told Murdoch about his conversation with Captain Smith, and later recalled that the weather was so clear that they could actually see the stars setting right down to the horizon. Then Lightoller left Murdoch in charge and set off on his rounds. Inside the wheelhouse, Quartermaster Oliver relinquished the helm to Quartermaster Hitchens, while in the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee came on duty. Just moments before 10 p.m., Quartermaster Hitchens called Quartermaster George Rowe, who was then standing watch on the stern docking bridge. Hitchens took a reading from the Cherub log, which trailed into the sea. It indicated that the ship had sailed 45 nautical miles since 8 p.m., a speed through the water of 22.5 knots. Even though the current was slowing the ship down, she was still making forward progress at over 22 knots. By the time that Lightoller had left the bridge, shortly after 10 p.m., leaving Murdoch as officer of the watch, Titanic's passengers were beginning to drift off for the night. In third class, the lights in the public rooms were extinguished at 10 p.m., bringing an abrupt end to the party there. The second-class dining saloon hymn sing-song wrapped up at about 10 o'clock as well. In first class, many passengers had also begun to drift off to bed, although there were still some groups of late-nighters enjoying some time spent with their friends and shipboard acquaintances in the first-class lounge, the smoking room, the Café Parisien adjacent to the restaurant, and the reception room. Titanic steamed on into the darkness. No one aboard had a clue of the horrors that lay just ahead, just over the horizon. A special thank you to our supporters on Patreon, NikkiChan92, Evan Fleming, Lucas Sidlowski, Bluebird Nut, Mark Gegenheimer, Martin Cahill, Maximilian Metcalf, Rachel Warner Sanchez, and Snow Monkey.